Marianne Cole had spent 19 years learning the exact temperature at which her husband's coffee stopped being perfect and started being cold again. Mari, how hard is this? She had learned it the way she'd learned everything else about being Daniel Cole's wife. Through repetition, through small corrections delivered in a reasonable voice, through the slow erosion of a woman who used to have opinions about things that weren't casseroles. She was 44 years old, and on the morning of her mother's funeral, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror in a black dress that had once belonged to a version of herself who still went to museums, and she practiced breathing. Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had died on a Tuesday quietly in the hospice bed by the window she'd asked for so she could watch the bird feeder Marianne's father kept full even now, even with nothing left to feed for. Eleanor had been sick for 11 months. Marianne had driven the 40 minutes to her parents' house in Millbrook, Ohio 3 or 4 times a week for most of that year, sitting with her mother through the chemo that didn't work and then through the part after the chemo stopped, when everyone quietly agreed to call it comfort care instead of what it was. Daniel had come to the hospital exactly twice. Both times he checked his watch before he'd checked on Eleanor. "I have a business, Mari," he liked to say in the tone of a man explaining something to a child. "Somebody has to keep the lights on." The business was Cole Restoration and Design, a home renovation company Daniel had built up over 2 decades into the kind of outfit that got featured in the county paper's Local Excellence issue every spring. It did well. It did well enough that Marianne, who had a business degree she'd never gotten to use, who had been the one who actually understood the difference between accrued and deferred revenue, had ended up doing the books for it. Unpaid, of course, because we're a family, Mari, we don't pay each other, for the last 15 years. She kept a green ledger, an old-fashioned paper one, alongside the software, because numbers on paper felt like something that couldn't be deleted with one keystroke by a man who got angry easily and forgot things conveniently. She had never told Daniel about the ledger. It wasn't a secret exactly. It was just hers, the one drawer in the house he'd never once opened, because opening drawers that weren't full of his own things had never occurred to him as something a person might do. They had met the way people meet in small towns, at a 4th of July picnic, both 23, Daniel already talking about the renovation crew he was going to start once he'd saved enough for a truck, Marianne fresh out of business school with a job offer from a firm in Columbus she never ended up taking. He'd been funny then. Charming in the specific way of a man who'd never once had to work very hard to be liked, who assumed likability was simply a fact about himself, the way other people assumed facts about their height or the color of their eyes. She'd liked that about him at 23. It had taken her the better part of 2 decades to understand that a man who assumes he's likable rarely bothers to ask whether he still is. The Columbus job had been the first thing she gave up. Not because Daniel asked her to, not outright. He was never so crude as to ask outright, but because he'd taken the job at his uncle's contracting outfit in Millbrook, and it had seemed at 24, like the natural thing to stay close, to be supportive, to let her own ambitions cool on the counter like the coffee she'd eventually learned to reheat exactly to his liking. Then came the wedding, and then the house, and then Daniel's first small crew, and then 3 years later, the moment that Marianne would later identify, in hindsight, the way you can only ever identify these things in hindsight, as the actual beginning of her marriage's real shape. Daniel's bookkeeper, an older woman named Pat who'd kept the company's accounts since its founding, retired, and Daniel had turned to Marianne at the dinner table and said, "You've got the degree for it. Might as well keep it in the family," and she had said yes because saying yes had always been easier than explaining why she might want to say no. He was good at it. That was the trap of it, really. She was genuinely, remarkably good at it, and being good at something is its own kind of quicksand because people stop asking if you want to keep doing it once they've decided you're the only one who can. Within 5 years Cole Restoration's books were the cleanest in the county, and within 10, Daniel had stopped thinking of the bookkeeping as something Marianne did for him and started thinking of it as something that simply existed, correct and current, the way running water simply existed when you turned the tap. He never asked how many hours it took her. He never asked if she still wanted her own career, the one she'd shelved at 24 for a picnic and a promise. He just handed her more. The family calendar, his mother's birthday logistics, the seating charts for 2 decades of harvest luncheons, because a woman who never says no eventually stops being asked whether she'd like to. The funeral was at 11. Daniel's mother, Vivian, was hosting the Cole family's annual harvest luncheon at 1. A tradition Daniel had built up over the years into something with a guest list of 40, catering staff, a rented tent, the whole production, timed every year to the second weekend of October regardless of what else might be happening in the world. This year what else was happening was Marianne burying her mother. "You'll be done by noon easy," Daniel had said 3 days earlier, standing in the kitchen with his laptop open to a spreadsheet of the luncheon's guest list, not looking at her. "Funerals don't take that long. You can swing by the venue after, help Mom with the setup. She's stressed about the seating chart." "Daniel. It's my mother's funeral." "I know whose funeral it is, Mari. I'm not an idiot." He'd finally looked up, and there had been something in his face she recognized from 21 years of marriage. Not cruelty exactly, just a total, bottomless confidence that his schedule was the schedule the world ran on. "I'm saying you can do both. People do both all the time. Life doesn't stop." She hadn't answered him. She'd learned over the years that not answering was sometimes the only version of an answer that didn't cost her anything. The morning was gray and hooded, the kind of Ohio October morning where the sky looks like it's deciding whether to commit to rain. St. Bartholomew's was full. Eleanor had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school for 31 years, and half of Millbrook had passed through her classroom at some point, had learned cursive and long division and how to be kind to the new kid because Mrs. Whitfield made kindness a subject she graded. The church held maybe 200 people comfortably. There were closer to 250 crowded into it that morning, standing in the back, spilling into the vestibule. Marianne sat in the front pew between her father, Walter, and her younger brother, Sam, who'd flown in from Denver. Walter was 71, a retired postal carrier, a small, quiet man who had loved Eleanor since he was 19 years old and had spent 11 months learning how to give her showers and change her dressings and never once complained where she could hear him. He held Marianne's hand through the whole service. He hadn't let go of it once. Daniel sat on her other side, checking his phone under the hymnal. The eulogy was Sam's. He'd asked to give it, said he needed to, and he stood up at the pulpit and talked about their mother's bird feeder and her handwriting and the way she used to grade papers at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her. And by the time he sat back down there wasn't a dry eye in the building except, Marianne noticed without meaning to notice, her husband's. They were graveside by 1040. Cedar Ridge Cemetery sat on a hill outside town with a view that Eleanor had picked out herself years ago, back when picking out a burial plot had felt like an abstraction instead of an appointment. The wind had come up. The funeral director had a green tent set up over the folding chairs, but Marianne stood instead of sat, because sitting felt like giving in to something, and she watched the casket lower and thought about bird feeders and cursive and a woman who had never once in 44 years made her daughter feel like a task. Daniel's phone rang at 10:52. She knew it was 10:52 because she looked at her own watch out of some instinct for documentation that 15 years of bookkeeping had trained into her, the same instinct that would later make her grateful in a cold and useful way that she'd looked. He didn't step away. That was the first thing. He didn't even lower his voice. He just answered it right there 8 feet from his mother-in-law's open grave and said, "Hey Mom, hang on, let me put you on speaker, I can't hear you over the wind," and pressed the button and held the phone up in the flat gray air like he was checking the score of a game. Vivian Cole's voice came through tinny and clear. "Daniel, I need Marianne here by noon. The chafing dishes came without the sterno and I need someone who actually knows where things go, not the caterers people, they don't know our system. She's a little tied up right now, Mom." Daniel actually laughed, a short, irritated laugh, the kind he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable. "We're at the cemetery." "Well, how much longer? Because if she's not here by noon the whole timeline falls apart. You know how your Aunt Risa gets if lunch is late." And this was the part that Marianne would replay for months afterward, would turn over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. Daniel looked at her. Actually looked at her, standing there in her black dress with dirt from her mother's grave still settling 6 feet down in front of her, and he said into the phone, loud enough that the nearest dozen mourners turned their heads, loud enough that her father, standing 3 feet away with his cane and his good funeral coat, went very still. "Mari, tell her you'll be there. Look, I get that today's hard, I do, but Mom's got 40 people coming in one funeral. You can grieve tomorrow. Put me before your mother for once, all right? I mean, before your mother's funeral. You know what I mean." 40 people did not, generally, hear things at cemeteries. Cemeteries were quiet by design. But grief has a way of sharpening the ear, of making a person hyper-aware of every sound that isn't the sound they're braced for. And so when Daniel Cole said "put me before your mother" into a phone held up like a trophy at his wife's mother's graveside, It did not disappear into the wind. It landed. It landed on Aunt Reese's cousin from Cincinnati and on Mrs. Petrosky from the church choir and on Sam, whose jaw went tight in a way Marianne hadn't seen since he was 14 and defending her from something. It landed most of all on Walter Whitfield, who had not raised his voice at another human being in Marianne's entire memory of him, and who now took one small deliberate step forward, put his hand very gently on his daughter's shoulder and said, not loudly, not for effect, just clearly, the way he used to read the weather off the porch each morning. Let's give him what he wants, sweetheart. Marianne looked at her father. There was nothing in his face that looked like anger. There was something else there, something she would later understand was closer to relief. The relief of a man who has watched his daughter fold herself smaller and smaller for 2 decades and has finally, at the worst possible moment, been handed a reason to say so out loud. Dad. Go on, Walter said. Go be exactly who he's asking for. I'll finish up here. Your mother would want you to see this through to the end, just not the end he thinks. She didn't understand him yet. She would in about 90 minutes. But something in his voice, the calm of it, the total absence of doubt, made her nod. Daniel, oblivious, was already telling his mother she's on her way. Mom, don't worry about the sterno. Tell the caterer we've got extra candles. And hanging up with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has solved a problem through the sheer force of stating what he wanted. Thank you, he said to Marianne and actually squeezed her arm like she'd done him a favor. This means a lot. I know today's rough. I'll make it up to you. I know you will, Marianne said, and her voice came out so even, so pleasant, that even Sam glanced at her strangely. The Cole family's harvest luncheon was held every year at the Millbrook Grange Hall, a whitewashed building with a wraparound porch that Vivian Cole rented out for $600 a day and decorated within an inch of its life, hay bales wrapped in burlap, mason jars of dried wheat, a banner that said Cole Family Harvest that had been reused so many autumns the letters had started to fade unevenly, like a flag left out too long. 40 guests. A rented tent extending off the porch for overflow seating. A 3-tier cake from the Good Bakery in Chillicothe. Caterers from Bellwether Catering, the same firm the Coles used every year, running trays of pulled pork and cornbread and green bean casserole between the kitchen and the buffet line. Marianne walked in at 11:58. She had not changed out of her funeral dress. She had not touched up her makeup, which had cried itself down her face twice that morning and dried into something raw and honest. She had, however, stopped at her car in the church parking lot and pulled 2 things out of the trunk, things she kept there for reasons she'd never examined too closely until this exact moment. A white bib apron left over from a fundraiser bake sale 2 years back, still folded in its plastic sleeve. And her wedding ring cleaning kit. A little velvet pouch with a cloth and a tiny brush, which she did not open. She just carried it in along with the apron into the Grange Hall, and put both on the head table in front of 40 of the Cole family's closest friends and business associates. She put the apron on over her black funeral dress. Vivian saw her first and beamed with the particular relief of a woman whose event was in jeopardy and has just been rescued. Oh, thank God, Marianne, the chafing dishes are a disaster. I need you on the drink station. We're short 2 servers and Reese is already asking about the wine. Of course, Marianne said. I'm here to serve. She worked the room like she'd worked it every October for 19 years. She refilled iced tea. She carried trays of cornbread past the long table where Daniel sat at the head, laughing with his business partner about a permit dispute, not once looking up to notice that his wife was pouring drinks in the same dress she'd buried her mother in 4 hours earlier. She smiled at Aunt Risa. She smiled at Mrs. Kowalczyk from the country club, who complimented the green bean casserole and asked not unkindly, "Rough morning, dear? You look tired." She smiled at all of it, and every smile cost her something, and she paid it because she understood now, standing in that hall with dirt from her mother's grave still on the toes of her good black shoes, that she was not performing servitude. She was performing a demonstration. She was showing every person in that room in the clearest language she had, exactly what her marriage had asked of her for 2 decades, laid out now in an apron and a black dress with nowhere left to hide it. At 1:15 when the toasts began, Daniel stood up with a glass of sparkling cider. He didn't drink, hadn't in years, prided himself on it, and gave his usual speech about family and gratitude and the Cole legacy, the same speech roughly that he gave every October, thanking his mother for the hard work, thanking the caterers, thanking everyone who made today possible. He did not thank Marianne. He never had. It hadn't occurred to him that there was anything to thank her for, because in 19 years of harvest luncheons, Marianne's contribution had never registered to him as labor. It had registered as weather. Something that simply happened, the way the leaves simply turned in October without anyone needing to be grateful to the leaves. When he sat down to applause, Marianne set down her tray. She untied the apron. She did it slowly, in full view of the head table, and folded it in neat thirds the way her mother had taught her to fold a dish towel, and set it down in the center of the buffet, right next to the cornbread, right where 40 people could see it. Then she took off her wedding ring. She had worn it for 19 years. It had left a groove in her finger, a pale channel of skin that had never seen sunlight, and it took a small effort to work it over that groove now, more effort than she expected, and for 1 second, just one, her hand shook. Then she set it on the serving tray next to a stack of small plates, and she straightened up and she said into a room that had gone very quiet in a voice that did not shake at all, "I want to thank everyone for having me today. I've served this luncheon for 19 years, same as I've served this marriage, quietly and for free and without anyone thinking to ask if I minded. This morning I buried my mother and my husband asked me on speakerphone at her grave to put him before her. So I did what he asked. I put him first. I came here and I served 40 of you lunch before I've had a single hour to grieve my own mother." She let that sit. Nobody moved. Vivian's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Somewhere near the back by the drink station she'd been manning 20 minutes earlier, Marianne heard a chair creak as someone shifted their weight, and then Mrs. Kowalczyk's voice, quiet but not quiet enough, said to the woman beside her, "Well, I'll be good for her." It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be a rallying cry. But it was the first time in 19 years that Marianne had heard anyone in that hall say something on her behalf instead of simply about her, and she filed the sound of it away the way she filed everything now, carefully, for later. "I raised 2 children in this town," she went on, because she found, once she'd started, that there was more in her than she'd expected, 19 years of it, waiting. "I ran a household. I kept the books for a business that made this family's whole reputation, every dollar of it accounted for, on time, every quarter for 15 years, without ever once being asked what I might want in return. I'm not angry that I did those things. I loved my children. I was good at the books. I don't regret the work." She looked finally at Daniel, who had gone very still, the way people go still when they sense a floor shifting under them but haven't yet located exactly where the crack is. "I regret that I let myself believe being useful and being loved were the same thing. They're not. I found that out about 4 hours ago at my mother's grave, and I'd rather find it out standing up than keep learning it on my knees. I think that's the last time I'll be doing that," Marianne went on. "Not the funeral part. The serving part. Effective today, I'm resigning from this position. I hope the caterers can cover the rest of the shift." Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped backward across the hardwood floor with a sound like something tearing. "Marianne, what is this? What are you doing? Sit down, you're embarrassing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, and turned and walked out of the Grange Hall in her funeral dress with her bare left hand swinging at her side, past 40 stunned faces and a folded apron and a wedding ring cooling on a tray of small plates, and out into an October afternoon that had, at some point in the last hour, decided to stop threatening rain and simply clear. Her father was waiting in the parking lot. She hadn't told him where she was going. She hadn't told anyone. But there he was, leaning against his old Buick with his cane and his funeral coat, like he'd always known this day was coming and had simply been waiting patiently, the way he waited for everything, for the exact moment it would arrive. "You knew," Marianne said, walking toward him. Her voice cracked for the first time all day. "This morning. When you said let's give him what he wants. You knew what I'd do." "I had a guess," Walter said. "You've been your mother's daughter your whole life, Mari." Eleanor never raised her voice either. She just stopped setting a second cup of tea for people who didn't deserve one. He opened the passenger door for her, an old habit older than her marriage. "Get in. I'll take you home." "Not his home. Yours. The one we're going to help you find." She sat in the passenger seat of her father's Buick in her funeral dress without her ring, and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry all day, not for her marriage, not yet, but for her mother finally, for hours late and 20 years overdue, and Walter drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on her shoulder the whole way, saying nothing at all, because there are some griefs a person doesn't need help naming. They just need somebody to sit next to them while they do it. What happened after is the part people in Millbrook still talk about in the particular way small towns talk about things. Carefully at first and then with less and less care as the story stopped being a rumor and started being common knowledge. Daniel called that night, then the next morning, then every hour after that, alternating between fury and a wounded, bewildered apology that never once specified what exactly he was apologizing for. Marianne let most of the calls go to voicemail. She listened to them later, once sitting at her father's kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, because she had learned, from 15 years of bookkeeping from a green ledger that had outlasted a marriage, that documentation was its own kind of dignity. If you wrote it down, it was real. If it was real, you could act on it. She hired a lawyer the following Monday. Not the family lawyer, the one who did coal restorations contracts and had been to their house for Christmas twice. A woman named Priya Anand out of Columbus, recommended by a former college roommate, who specialized in divorce cases involving closely held small businesses. Marianne brought the green ledger to their first meeting in a canvas tote bag, 15 years of it, every invoice, every payroll run, every unreported cash job Daniel had taken for 2 decades and never quite gotten around to putting through the books properly. "This is extraordinary," Priya said, flipping through it. "You kept all of this by hand?" "I kept all of it by hand because I didn't trust him not to delete it," Marianne said. "I do the books. I've done the books for 15 years. He's never once opened this drawer." It turned out that not opening drawers has consequences. Ohio was an equitable distribution state, and coal restoration and design, whatever Daniel liked to believe about it being his company that he'd built, had been built substantially on the marital labor of a wife who'd handled every dollar of it unpaid for a decade and a half, while also raising their 2 now-grown children and running every logistic of his extended family's calendar. The ledger didn't just prove what the business had made. It proved, in Marianne's own careful handwriting, exactly how much of its success had depended on her. Their 2 children, Emma and Josh, were grown by then. Emma finishing a graduate program in Pittsburgh, Josh 2 years into a job in Charlotte, and Marianne had dreaded telling them almost as much as she dreaded the deposition. She hadn't needed to. Emma's response when Marianne finally called her that first Sunday night was a long silence and then a quiet, "Mom, I've been waiting for you to do this since I was 16. Josh drove up from Charlotte the following weekend without being asked, spent 2 days helping her pack boxes out of the house she'd shared with Daniel for 18 years, and told her, somewhere around the second box of kitchenware, that he'd always assumed she liked being the one who managed everyone's schedule, because she'd never once complained about it in front of them. "I didn't know I was allowed to complain about it," she told him, and watched her son's face do something complicated, something between grief and relief, that she recognized because she'd been wearing the same expression on her own face for months. The divorce took 11 months, the same length of time Marianne noted privately that her mother's illness had taken, a symmetry she chose to find meaningful rather than morbid. It was not gentle. Daniel fought her on the business valuation, fought her on the house, hired an aggressive attorney out of Cincinnati who tried at one point to argue that Marianne's contributions to the business had been informal and therefore not properly compensable, an argument that fell apart spectacularly the moment Priya introduced 15 years of a green ledger, cross-referenced against the company's own tax filings, showing discrepancies that made Daniel's accountant visibly pale in the deposition. By the time it settled, Marianne walked away with the house. She didn't particularly want it, too many rooms full of a marriage she was done grieving, so she sold it within the year. A settlement that reflected her actual, documented contribution to the business, and something she hadn't expected to want as badly as she did. Her name off every joint account, every guarantee, every liability Daniel had quietly attached her to over 2 decades without ever quite explaining what he was asking her to sign. Millbrook, meanwhile, did what small towns do. The story of the funeral, the speakerphone, the apron, the ring on the serving tray, made its way through the Grange Hall guest list within days and the rest of the town within weeks, gaining detail and losing nothing in the telling. Coal restoration and design lost 2 contracts that winter from clients who said, carefully, that they'd heard some things and wanted to go a different direction. Vivian Cole stopped hosting the Harvest Luncheon the following October, the first year in 2 decades it hadn't happened, and nobody in town seemed especially surprised or especially sorry. Daniel, for his part, did not go bankrupt or vanish or suffer any of the cinematic collapses a bitter person might have wished on him. He kept the business. He kept most of his clients. But something had shifted in how Millbrook looked at him. A coolness at the hardware store, a slowness in the invitations, the particular permanent cost of having been witnessed, clearly and completely by 40 people at once, being exactly the kind of man you'd spent years insisting you weren't. Marianne turned 45 that spring, in a 2-bedroom rental with good light and a kitchen table just her size. She went back to work, not bookkeeping for someone else's business this time, but her own small practice, Cole Ledger Services. She kept the last name for the business. It was, after all, the name on 15 years of the work that had built her competence, and she'd earned the right to decide what it meant now. She did the books for 6 small businesses in the county within her first year. A bakery, a landscaping company, a used bookstore, a hair salon, 2 contractors who'd heard, through the same grapevine that had ruined Daniel's reputation, that Marianne Cole was meticulous, honest, and did not miss a discrepancy. Sam flew back from Denver twice that year, once for no reason at all, just to sit on her porch and drink coffee that she made exactly as hot as she liked it. Walter came over every Sunday for dinner, a tradition they built themselves, new, with no history of anyone's schedule mattering more than anyone else's. And Marianne learned, slowly, what it felt like to cook a meal for someone who thanked her for it every single time, like it was still, after 40 Sundays, a genuine surprise that she'd bothered. She thought about her mother often. Not the illness. That part faded the way Priya had promised her it would, into something softer and further away. But the bird feeder and the cursive and the particular quality of Eleanor's attention, the way she'd made every 3rd grader in that classroom for 31 years feel, for at least 1 hour a day, like the most interesting person in the room. Marianne understood finally, standing in her own kitchen with her own ledger and her own name on the door, that this was the inheritance her mother had actually left her. Not the house, not even the bird feeder, which Walter kept filled to this day. It was the knowledge that you could be endlessly generous with people without ever once agreeing to disappear for them. She didn't remarry. She dated, eventually, carefully, a man named Robert who ran the bookstore whose accounts she managed, a quiet, unhurried man who once, on their 3rd date, asked her what she wanted for dinner before he said what he wanted, and she'd had to excuse herself to the restroom for a minute because it had taken her that long to realize nobody had asked her that question first and longer than she could remember. Every October now she hosts her own dinner. Small, 6 or 7 people, her father and Sam when he's in town, and Robert and a couple of the women from her old church choir who'd quietly, kindly reached out after everything happened. There's no seating chart. There's no green ledger under the table tracking who contributed what. There's just a table set the night before with a candle in the middle and a chair for everyone who's coming, and Marianne cooks because she likes to cook, and everyone at that table clears their own plate, every single time without being asked, because that had ended up being the smallest and truest thing she'd taken from the whole ordeal. A life-size to the people who actually showed up for it, instead of the ones who only ever called when they needed something served. Her father says it best most Sundays, somewhere around dessert, looking at the table like he still can't quite believe his luck at being invited to something so unremarkable and so entirely hers. "Your mother would like this," he says. "She always did like a table where everybody carries their own weight." And Marianne, 45 years old, unafraid for the first time in a long time of what might come next, always says the same thing back. "I know. I think that's why I built it this way." Sometimes, clearing the table after everyone's gone home, she thinks about the apron folded in thirds on the buffet, and the ring cooling on the tray, and she doesn't feel triumphant about it exactly the way she might have expected to feel in the years when she still imagined a scene like that as a kind of victory lap. Mostly she just feels quiet. Mostly she just feels like a woman who spent 19 years setting a table for people who never once asked if she wanted to sit down, and who finally, at 44, in a black dress with dirt still on her shoes, pulled out her own chair. She keeps the green ledger still in a drawer in her own kitchen now, though there's less in it these days that needs hiding. Just her own numbers, honest and current, nobody's but hers. Some nights she takes it out anyway, out of habit more than necessity, and pages through the old entries, 15 years of another life written in her own steady hand, and she doesn't feel the grief she once thought she would. She feels something closer to pride. Every column had balanced in the end. It had just taken her a while to understand that she was allowed to be one of the numbers on the ledger too, not just the one keeping count.